I think for the GSTs, given the wide audience here, clearly we know that these are genetic deficiencies. The majority of them are autosomal recessive. There are just a few which are X-linked, and those are specifically GST type 9 of phosphorylase kinase. And some deficiencies will just affect one tissue. Some of them affect many, many tissues. And some, even within individuals in the same family, will have very different clinical manifestations. And thus, they're a real challenge. And listening to the patient, I think, helps us out. So just to put this clearly, when we eat, we store energy. When we fast, we release this stored energy. And so the energy equals glucose. And so this is just the entire pathway. But to keep it simple, the majority of diseases that we deal with, which are the glycogen storage diseases, are cytosolic. There's just one, which is lysosomal storage disease type 2, or GST type 2 or Pompe disease, which is also a lysosomal storage disease. I won't be talking about that one here today. And to get our concepts clear is that once we eat, we store energy, and we largely store it as glycogen. And then in the fasting state, we're releasing this energy. So in the first few hours of the fast, what we release really is from glycogen. After we've exhausted the glycogen reserves, which are primarily in the liver and in the muscle, we go to the next source, which is protein, what we call neoglucogenesis, or making glucose from protein. And the third stage of the fast, when we've exhausted these, is coming from fat or from ketogenesis. So just when we focus on the glycogen storage diseases, when you get a history of a fast, of a hypoglycemia occurring within the first few hours of a fast, you can start thinking that the condition is a glycogenosis. So I think this is a key point. Listen to the patient, and you've got a diagnosis pretty much there. Now let's understand this glycogen molecule. It looks like the branches of a tree. It's a very complex molecule with all these being polymers of glucose, and these dark points are what we call the branch points of glucose. And the reason for this is that if we had it in the plant-like structure or a myelopectin, our livers would be massively enlarged to store this amount of glycogen. So this degradation of glycogen that occurs depends on two critical enzymes. One, which is phosphorylase, which helps with the outer branches of the glycogen complex molecule. And the second is the debranching enzyme, which has two functions. But to keep it simple, is it the inner parts of this branch, but also the branch point, which I showed you in the previous slide, which was black. As a result of which, we get free release of glucose from this complex glycogen molecule dependent on two particular enzymes. And so when we are fasting, we need the presence of both phosphorylase as well as of debranching enzyme to efficiently break down the glycogen completely. So this is just to outline that there are multiple glycogen storage diseases, and I think calling GST0 a glycogen storage disorder is actually a misnomer, because there is no glycogen to store. In fact, it's an absence of glycogen synthase, and so it's not able to break down any glycogen, and so there's not even much stored there, and we're trying to change the literature on this. Now, 1A and 1B, I think, was discussed, so I'm going to try and keep it very easy and simple as we go along. The point I want to make is that this particular enzyme is expressed not only in the liver, as we often want to think of it as a liver metabolic disease, it's very largely expressed in the kidney and also in the intestinal mucosa. And so, as was stated earlier, there is a big renal component to glycogen storage disease type 1. And if we were to do a liver transplant, what we would do would fix the issues of the liver, but we would not fix the issues related to the kidney. And so this is data that's emerging as we understand more and more about these GSTs. Glycogen storage disease type 3, as I told you, is the one which is important in the breakdown of glycogen. And so because it's not available, you're going to have hypoglycemia. But think about it, that you've got the first enzyme, which is phosphorylase, to break it down. So the symptoms of GST3 will come on a little later, in the sense that the child will not be as dependent on an extraneous source of glucose as in glycogen storage disease type 1, which, as I'll show you, is a block both in the breakdown of glycogen as well as in making glucose from protein. So GST type 1 can really be life-threatening. The other glycogen storage diseases, because they have alternate pathways, can make some glucose, but after those are exhausted, like in GST type 3, when the utility of phosphorylase is done, that's when the symptoms of hypoglycemia come about. So moving along, these are the liver glycogen storage diseases. There are a bunch of them, and I'll focus on the most common one, which is von Gierke, or type 1 glycogen storage disease. And I won't go into the details of this, other than GST1A is because of the enzyme deficiency glucose 6 phosphatase, and 1B is because of the lack of the transporter protein. And the symptoms of 1A and 1B are very similar, other than what was discussed, that because of the transporter defect, there are problems with the neutrophils and also with the colon, or what we call an enterocolitis. So whenever you're seeing the lipemic appearance to the serum, the presence of low glucose, the presence of a lactic acid, the presence of uric acid, think glycogen storage disease type 1, and then if you have the addition of neutropenia, think 1B. Now, as we've learned more about these conditions, depending on the location of the mutation, there are some patients even with glycogen storage disease type 1A that have neutropenia and a neutrophil dysfunction. So once again, the delineation is never clear in metabolism, and we've always got to do mutation analysis in the perfect world to confirm a diagnosis of these. So this is where the block exists for GST type 1. The lack of conversion of glucose 6-phosphate to glucose. So glycogen gets completely blocked here, as a result of which the alternative pathways are hyperactive right now. And so the glycogen ultimately gets converted into uric acid. As the glycogen goes down further, pyruvate gets converted into lactate. That's why we have the lactic acidosis. You have an increase in the alanine levels because pyruvate gets converted to alanine. And then some of this glucose 6-phosphate gets converted from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA to give you cholesterol and triglycerides. So just looking at this particular slide, you can really understand the metabolic sequelae of glycogen storage disease type 1. So pay attention to biochemistry, because you have all your answers then. And you see the block here, and as was shown by Dr. Bavdekar, there's an accumulation of the step before and then all the metabolic processes which occur. So in childhood, what you really see is an enlargement of the liver and the kidneys. In fact, if you look at the textbooks, it talks of it as a hepatorenal condition, not just as hepatomegaly. So we often overlook the presence of enlarged kidneys in glycogen storage disease type 1. And needless to say, if you have hypoglycemia, you're going to have poor growth, you'll have the low glucose, and here are the metabolic sequelae of GST type 1. So this is a child with GST type 1. He's 5 years old, but looks like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old because he's got failure to thrive and he's got this significant hepatomegaly. Now, the goals of the nutritional therapy, and this was a question that was raised, how do you manage type 1 GST? If you've got a block in both glycogenolysis and in neoglucogenesis, essentially the body is only going to depend on free glucose or on a source of glucose to be able to survive. That's why in the past, children with GST type 1 often died. And the way you can manage this is by either doing it with cornstarch, which I believe in India we're getting it more as corn flour. The important part, once again, for our Indian audience here, is that corn flour may not be as efficient as cornstarch. And the second part is stick with the same brand, because it really depends on the brand that you're using for the duration that you can manage the patient with a low glucose. The second component is that it needs to be in the uncooked form, because the moment you cook it, the cornstarch is already broken down into glucose, as a result of which then we're going to have a sudden surge of glucose and then a sudden drop. The whole purpose of cornstarch is to serve as a slow release form of the glucose. And so the methods really to do it is in the first year of life, often when the amylase is not very well developed, is by doing frequent feeding, or what we call the overnight tube feedings. And then later on, as the body is able to tolerate it, one can do the uncooked cornstarch. And the range can be anywhere from 1.75 to 2.5 grams per kilogram every 6 hours. The important part of the GST-1 diet is you've got to even avoid fructose and sucrose, because those ultimately get converted into glucose 6-phosphate, and that's where the block is. You cannot convert glucose 6-phosphate into glucose. So the formula really for an infant is to provide, they have higher glucose requirements, so it's about 8 to 10 milligrams of glucose per kilogram per minute. And as one gets older, the glucose requirements go down. So an adult with GST type 1 would require about 4 to 5 milligrams per kilogram per minute of glucose. The reason I emphasize this is because often there's an overtreatment that goes on, and they become what we call cornstarch eaters. And not only is that bad from a dietary perspective, but ultimately it can result in a type 2 diabetes kind of picture, which we are seeing more and more right now with our adult GST-1 population. So it's like a paradoxical situation. On one hand, you've got hypoglycemia, and on the other hand, you've got a challenge with type 2 diabetes. So the complications of GST-1 still do occur despite good treatment, and some of them, of course, can be avoided, but some of them persist. And for the audience here, for liver situations, there is a real risk of development of what we call tumors of the liver, which are often adenomas. But now what we're seeing is that there can be a transformation of these adenomas into hepatocellular carcinoma. So the reason I stress this is that in teenage years, these individuals often develop adenomas. And once they develop these adenomas, I think there has to be a very strict monitoring by imaging studies where ultrasound can actually miss a diagnosis of a liver adenoma. So you may have to end up by doing MRI of the abdomen, looking for these adenomas. And if there's a rapid increase in the size or in the number of the adenomas, then often a liver resection, or in some situations, a liver transplant is often required. The reason I say this is that this conversion to a hepatocellular carcinoma is very unclear at this time. What really converts the adenoma into a carcinoma, and we don't have good monitoring tools for it. Even at the time of HCC, many of these individuals can have a normal AFP. So this is one of the challenges in the field, which I think we are all working on collaboratively right now to learn about. And so this is just the first report showing hepatocellular carcinoma in a series of glycogen storage disease type 1 long-term survivors. So with management and with good glucose intake in the form of cornstarch, one would expect the uricemia, the hyperuricemia to correct, but we find that some individuals still require allopurinol to prevent gout. Some of them do require lipid-lowering medications, and we've used Lipitor, but at very, very low doses, when, for instance, the triglycerides are above 1,000 milligrams, despite very good management. And then the ACE inhibitors for microalbuminuria. In some instances, we do end up requiring a combined liver and kidney transplant in these patients. And as we talked about, the use of GCSF very cautiously and as indicated for those with type 1B. Now, for a diagnosis of glycogen storage disease, I think the best way to do it is, of course, clinically, but you can really confirm it by mutation analysis. Luckily, both these genes are small, but in the case of GST-1B, there's a lot of heterogeneity of where the mutations lie. But very often, one has to depend on mutation analysis for 1B, just because of the lack of separation of 1A and 1B in the first couple of years of life. And some of the new advances in type 1 glycogen storage disease is, as you can imagine, they can develop hypovitaminosis D. This is because of the very restricted nature of the diet that they have, as well as the kidney involvement that these patients have. So we've recently published on this information. And second is the use of medium chain triglycerides in glycogen storage disease type 1. This has been found to be very important and effective in lowering the triglyceride levels in these patients as an effective means of providing adequate calories, but also to avoid the hypertriglyceridemia. So now let's talk about type 3, and I think if we cover these two, we'll understand a lot. So this is the glycogen molecule, this is the branch point, this is the single glucose molecules as part of the branch point. So phosphorylase acts right here. Here is where GST3 or the debranching enzyme acts. It helps in the movement of this to the long chain, and it gets rid of this branch point. And so if you're missing the debranching enzyme over here, what's going to accumulate is really a glycogen molecule now with short terminal branches. And think about this, that if you've got an abnormal structure of glycogen now, you're going to have a foreign body kind of reaction in the liver. And this is the distinguishing feature for GST type 1 versus type 3, is in type 3 you're going to have an enlargement of the liver, but in addition to that, very often you're going to have massive increases in the SGOT and SGPT, which you do not see in type 1 glycogen storage disease. The second difference is the presence of lactic acidosis in type 1 because of the conversion of glucose 6-phosphate ultimately from pyruvate to make lactate, which you do not see in type 3. So once again, in the case that was presented, in that differential, type 3 really should not be there. First of all, because of a normal AST and ALT, and the second, because of a normal lactate. So there are different subtypes of type 3, but the most important ones are type 3A and type 3B. And the real difference between them is that 3A is involvement of both the liver and the muscle, and 3B is only a selective involvement of the liver. The important part here is more from a therapeutic standpoint, because if we are considering a liver transplant, in type 3B you'll have a full correction, but in type 3A you'll have a persistence and a progression of the myopathy, which can develop in these individuals as they get older. So the part about type 3 that's really tricky is that the presentation is extremely variable. And so even within individuals who have type 3A, where there is a muscle component to the disease, the extent of involvement of myopathy, that is of the skeletal muscle, and or cardiomyopathy can be very variable. And even within a family, you can have one with significant cardiomyopathy, and then another with myopathy, and a third with completely apparent no involvement of the skeletal muscle or the heart muscle. So really, genetic counseling becomes a bit of a challenge, and mutation analysis has not helped sort this out. So we are going now for more whole genome studies to understand this condition better. So as we said, in type 3, if you have an abnormal structure of glycogen, it really provokes over time the presence of liver fibrosis, which when you do a liver biopsy, even in the newborn period, very often, that's another distinguishing feature. The presence of periportal fibrosis is seen in type 3. You'll never see this in type 1. And over the course of time, these individuals can develop a progressive liver cirrhosis and a liver failure. The other part is that they can also develop cancer. And so one more reason why we've really got to understand this condition better. So the complications with GST type 3, as I said, is liver cirrhosis, and the other complication really is a progressive myopathy. So these are two little girls with GST type 3. This is an adult with GST type 3. He's one of the oldest survivors, and if you note here, he's got small muscle involvement of the hands, and this led us to think that is there a neuropathic component to this disease, and now we do have evidence to show that not only is this a muscle disease, there is a peripheral nerve involvement. In fact, there is median nerve involvement in GST type 3. So this is something else that needs to be looked at, and we recently published this manuscript. And now we've also got guidelines for type 3 glycogen storage disease, which I would encourage the postgraduates here to look at, as it would help further on. So in terms of management, it's clearly less demanding than type 1. You've got intact neoglucogenesis, so you can actually feed the child with a high protein diet and make a source of glucose as compared to GST type 1. And so there are alternative pathways of fuel metabolism that can be used in type 3, which you do not use in type 1. The second difference is that you do not have to really restrict the intake of sucrose or fructose as you would in type 1 glycogen storage disease. And the other part is liver transplantation in some cases. We've also done cardiac transplant in some cases with GST type 3. So this is a very large gene, 35 exons, making it very challenging for the diagnosis. But there's a common mutation in exon 3, which can help you diagnose GST type 3B. So this is the one good part about type 3, is that there's some genotype-phenotype correlation, at least for 3A versus 3B. And now GST type 4. I think I can stop after this particular one because the others we've already talked about. Fanconi-Bickel is glycogen synthase is very important in the making of the glycogen molecule. And the second important component is the branching enzyme, which helps with these branch points to give the complex structure to glycogen. So if you're missing branching enzyme, you think about it, all you have is polymers of glucose, and what it looks like then is the plant-like structure or amylopectin. So you do not want this because it's going to result in hepatomegaly and once again an abnormal structure of glycogen. So the sequelae will be similar to type 3 except more aggressive in nature, where these patients can develop liver cirrhosis and liver failure very early in life. Now, so there won't be this branch structure, and it's just going to be the tree-like structure of glycogen. The one caution for glycogen storage disease type 1 for this audience is that it's extremely heterogeneous in its presentation in terms of the tissue involvement, the age of onset, and the clinical manifestations. So in fact, there is the very severe neonatal presentation which progresses to liver cirrhosis, and there is the presence of the marked elevation of liver enzymes. But in addition to that, there is the form which is the non-progressive milder hepatic form, and very often these are the children that end up on a transplant list, and there are few mutations that you find in the gene for branching enzyme which, if present, are considered to be hepatoprotective. So I think this is really, really important because this is waste of a liver on a child who may not need it. So I think with that, I'm going to have to end because of the timing issue, but I think covering these 3 glycogen storage diseases is really critical. And the one other part that I did want to talk about at the very end is that these GSDs have very many differential features, but with the availability of molecular diagnosis, one should really try and use it. Liver biopsy for enzyme testing in most cases is useful, but can be complicated because the sampling of the sample of this liver tissue is difficult. And liver GSDs, I think, are very common in the Indian population. The treatment can be extremely simple and life-changing, and it can be life-threatening on the other hand if not picked up. And I want to tell you that adults with GSD1 are now not at all not a reality. We have many adults with GSD1 who've had multiple pregnancies, and here's an example of a GSD1 female who's had a triplet pregnancy, and these are her children. And I wanted to close by just telling you that research continues. We've got a therapy. Cornstarch was work that was developed right at Duke University where I am. And now as a group, we are working on a modified starch which would be better tasting and which we hope would be more long-lasting than the current use of the Argo cornstarch which we use in the US. And there are studies done in Europe already which have been very promising with the use of these new starches, where it can last for a longer period of time and result in less abdominal bloating, and you may need a smaller amount and still have the same impact. So even in these rare metabolic disease conditions, I think when the groups work together collectively, we can advance research. And the other part is we've got multiple animal models now for GSD type 1, for type 2, for type 3, as well as for type 4. And so we're working on newer therapies, and I'm hoping over the years we will make a change in the lives of these people. Thank you.